Quatre Batailles in Espagne. Well, so it was enjoyable to play a tactical system. It's been a while since I've done anything Napoleonic. I don't think I've caught any Napoleonic tactical on video yet. Maybe a very light thing, but I don't think so even there. So that's been really enjoyable. I have a decent number of Napoleonic games, but they're usually a harder burden for a number of reasons. And because I've always had some, they're kind of lower on my list than, say, touching something like I don't know, Spanish Succession, which I did sometime. So you get a fair amount of stuff in this game. There's no question of that. And let's talk about the components, I guess, first, for whatever reason. A bunch of player aid cards. What's really, I guess, kind of cool is these, the hit marker cards. They probably could have just been put on paper so you could photocopy them. As they are, I found using a grease pencil so-so on them. They didn't clean up terribly well with it. It worked. They have enough of a gloss that it worked, but putting them in a plastic sheet works better, in which case, well, did you really need something this fancy? I don't know. But I appreciate good quality components like that anyway, so here you have the terrain effects chart. It takes a little while to get used to reading, but I guess it's pretty good. This, probably a waste of the heavier stock that it's on. It gives you the terrain key and some counter explanation. But it also is basically almost this should be on the back of the box, but there's already a back of the box because it says, more than what's in the box and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. It seems a little silly. Here you have charts and tables. Now what's funny about these suckers, and I wish they had used the extra card as a player aid for this, there's none of the optional rules included in here at all, which means that there are some modifiers and some things in this that are not addressed properly if you're playing with the optional rules. And there are things in the optional rules that you really like reminders of that you kind of have to flip through the rules. Now my solution to that, there were a couple of things. One, there's no sequence of play, so I made a card for that. And the other is I tried to make a tiny little optional rules summary, but if you used a whole sheet of paper or of stock, it would be a lot better. The maps, single-sided, no numbers on the hexes, which makes setup a bitch. You could write numbers very, very faintly, or not on every hex the way the gamers do it or whatever, and you could get that. The graphic style, it's not really my taste, but it's kind of in that Rick Barber style. Some people love them, some people, like me, kind of don't. You get 4 different sets of maps and battles, and there are a couple of extra battles that, kind of smaller ones, that are good as training exercises to learn the game, but not really terribly interesting in either case as actual playable scenarios. The battles themselves are a mixed bag. I found the middle 2, Salamanca and Vitoria, the most interesting. Part of that may be because the first one, Ocaña, I was kind of learning the system during still. And then the last one, Sauraran, has rough terrain, but there were other issues with it that I did not like. The presentation of the scenario book, the setup instructions, like I said, no hex numbers, well, they end up being kind of painful the way they describe setup. Things like a line between these 2 cities, halfway along that line, deploy this unit, whatever. You can usually figure it out, but then some of them end up, at least in Ocaña I think it was, referring to positions of other units and where you'd be positioned in relation to maybe a terrain feature and the other unit. And it's just like, oh, come on, you could make this so much easier on us. And the rule book itself is written in a fairly light style. I found that that tends not to be as nailed down as a modern rule book is, but it's kind of more pleasing to read. The optional rules are not well supported at all, though. There are often ambiguities. There are some ambiguities in the base rules, or things that you look at and say, how can that be? So one example of that is the artillery fire, which looks like the artillery never fires at its full strength. Now, one of my friends said, well, that's ridiculous, online. Who's playing it, we're just going to, instead of reducing the fire at 1 hex, we're going to assume it gets full fire at 1 hex. There is a slight difference beyond just the numerical intent. There is a possible reason the designer wanted it that way, and it has to do with fire modifiers and the accumulation of artillery points, etc. So there are situations where you would not be able to get the same values if units were firing just 1 point. If they had 1 point less and you counted terrain penalties as you would in normal games. So I'm left continuing to play by the rules as written, but I'm not sure I believe them. There's something very, you kind of expect the designer to step in and say, yeah, that's right, I mean what I said here. Because of the language used in the game rules in certain cases, sometimes you wonder if the intention is what you're reading. When you get to the actual optional rules, I'll get to them in a bit. I think that's what I really want to discuss in detail. The counters themselves are largely serviceable and very, very attractive. I find it difficult to kind of tell the formations. Sometimes I got artillery and cav mixed up just because, all they have on them. The artillery have little guns on them and a wagon and everything, but sometimes that looks similar to me to how the cav looks in column. I don't know, but I found myself having some difficulty looking at the two. The biggest problem, though, is these little numbers here. This is really the unit identifier, and it's very, very tiny. My eyes are going bad, and I can't read them very easily. I have to, or put on my reading glasses, which I don't like doing in the middle of a game. But if you've got healthy eyes, if you're under the age of 40 or lucky genetically, you'll have no problem with this. I'm sure there are people who are farsighted at an earlier age. I've known some. Okay. The counter mix itself is not quite sufficient. The numerical counters, because of the way that they're used and the way that a scenario might play out in terms of when the damage happens, sometimes run out for a specific number. Worse, there aren't enough skirmishers to really support some of the larger battles. Skirmishers are an optional rule, though, but still, there's not quite the support for the optional rules that you'd want. All right, to the system itself. It uses a very formation-based means of describing how units react and operate. And I find that difficult to not grasp, but on lookups. I'm used to, hey, I want to look up, the fire values for something. I look in the fire combat section, not in the combat formation section, which is actually where it's spelled out here. That's a very minis flavor to it, and it may actually save some space. So I'm going to chalk it up to I don't like it because I'm unfamiliar with it more than anything else. There's a lot in this design that seems to come closer to the minis, the style of minis rules writing. Much looser, much lighter. Board games tend to really try to nail everything down with the, we've got too many board game wargamers who are into trying to rules lawyer their way out of something. And this rule book doesn't at all address that. It's very much, you saw some of this back in the in some companies' materials back in the 70s and 80s, but in general, the board gaming, the SPI, and even the Avalon Hill made messes of their rules quite often, but the idea was generally to provide you with a manual that gave you, answers to whatever questions you had. You would find the exact wording that was correct. SPI was better at it than Avalon Hill in terms of presentation, but that was the concept. And that concept has kept throughout board wargaming. But here, and I suspect in the Labatt and Battles of the Age of Reason, you also see this kind of minis influence, because I struggle with those, with the Battles from the Age of Reason at least, rulebook, for a similar sort of way. It's all based on the formation, and it's just a different way of looking at it and hard to catch up. The movement in combat, there's nothing too exciting here in terms of, this is pretty standard. You move up to units, you have 1 hex firing range for infantry, advantages to attacking in column. You got all the little toys that make a Napoleonic system seem to work. The only thing that I felt was the units felt just a little too rigid. They can back out of a hex. That was something that I got wrong that really made it too rigid. They can back out of a hex and withdraw in that sort of fashion without taking flanking fire. Another strange thing is that fire doesn't have a greater chance of affecting the unit if it's coming from a flank or rear position. That's odd to me because of what fire represents. It's not necessarily just the amount of lead hitting the amount of bodies. You sometimes see mini systems arguing that flanking fire, because it cuts through more men, is going to cause more damage. That's not what it is. It's the psychological effect. And unless you get a successful fire roll of one sort or another, you're not going to get a morale check. And the effect of hitting someone in the flank increases the desertions, which are accounted for in the fire combat table, and stragglers, and actual casualties, and all of that shakes up the morale. You do get a huge morale penalty from being hit from the flank or rear, but I think you should probably also have a greater chance of effectiveness. And most games tend to take that into effect. This one does not, and it feels a little strange there. Skirmishers also feel a little strange, but it's a nice abstract system. That's part of the optional rules, but basically you can throw them at each other and they cancel each other out, and they allow you to make your advance safely against a force with other skirmishers. If you have a force like the Spaniards in this that don't have skirmishers, that's somewhat problematic, because then you take some fire coming in on an advance. Speaking of which, the specific rules for all the scenarios in this game are kind of tucked away in the back of the scenario book in a place where you would not expect. Like, it's all the way here on page 16. So you start playing, you think you have the rules, you see there's no specific rules, you figure they're per scenario, and there are some per scenario. And then maybe you're through the first scenario or something, you decide to read the designer's notes, like I did, or maybe you've already read them because they're where they belong at the back of the book, and then you notice, wait a minute, what the hell is this? I've got different amounts of skirmishers than I'm expected to, from the base rules. It's not a horrible thing. It's just, if the designer's intent is to get that point across, and that, so much of this is of that nature, it kind of fails because it's hidden. It's in a place where players may not easily find it. You want to make it as easy as possible on the players to play the game. Melee, I tended not to do melee. I'm not a big fan of doing melee. The problem with it is, in line formation, you're not terribly good at attacking. In column formation, you get a bonus on attacking in melee, but your firepower is reduced. And the better units tend to have good firepower values. There's an interesting concept here in the game, which is that your infantry units don't decrease in fire value as they take hits. I think that's a little oversimplified. If a unit is taking significant hits that it's at half strength or something, it seems like that fire value would be reduced a little bit. It's not based on the step size of the units at all. However, I think most games probably overemphasize the size of the unit and how much firepower is coming out of it. They try to do some kind of analysis on the frontage presented, etc. This probably comes closer to the reality than most games do on that. For melee value, though, the size of your units does matter, and each unit has a melee multiplier, essentially. And then terrain effects, as far as I can tell, this is sometimes hard to discern from the rules, terrain effects reduce either your fire value on a per unit basis, or they reduce your melee multiplier. And that can go down to 0, basically, where you just don't want to fire. Well, you can't fire and you don't want to attack. Cav is always a big deal in a Napoleonic system. They're handled fairly simply here. You have a possibility for countercharging, but it's generally at 1 hex unless you're playing with optional rolls, which means you have to be very careful in presenting your defensive cav or deploying it. It's sometimes hard. You think, well, I got a cav out here near the flank, that should be able to cover it, and then you look and they're like, oh man, they can slip through and hit a flank of the unit because there's a channel I wasn't, really considering too much. It does allow for exploitation where cav unit slams into one unit and just keeps going into the next unit. I always like that kind of thing. I don't know. It happened. I don't know how often it happens, but it's a pleasing little bit to me in the game. I think probably cav usually was pretty tired after hitting a unit of the size of these, usually. Let's see. You got your square checks. Cav is pretty damn ineffective against square, and you have the option to not hit the square with your cav. This is kind of nice. Every now and then cav would hit a square, but it almost never happened. If infantry formed a square, the cav would pretty much say, screw that, man, we're going home. And the way they handle that in this is they give the cav just a 1-point melee multiplier on it, instead of what they usually have, which is like 5 or 6 on a charge, which is just huge. So unless you're facing a really tiny force, you're not gonna want to charge things. You're not going to want to charge a square. It's a good way of getting units into square, though. And getting units into square is useful because it improves your chances of firing at them, and it reduces their firing because they're, not able to form a line and fire properly. Morale is really weird in this game. You use it with these markers. They indicate the turn in which the unit became disorganized. And then 2 turns later, it's allowed to rally. I like that. It prevents... a lot of games have this sort of... units get disordered and then they rally right away, and you never really feel like the army's reforming in the same way. Or maybe their chances of rallying are too low on any given turn. It's kind of nice to say, it takes a certain amount of time minimum for a disorder to happen, to be recovered from. The difficulty is these become a more mechanically complex solution, and that's always your trade-off, right? Model something a little bit more realistically, and you end up throwing some level of complexity into the game, either too much burden, some kind of burden on the players. The game is strongly based on an army demoralization model, where if you take a certain number of hits, the whole army has a chance of kind of falling back, and it also gets a reduced morale on the per unit basis. Hits can also reduce your morale for a unit. They can get less and less effective to stay in the line. Units can usually defend with crappy morale, but they have a hard time launching an attack because as soon as they take fire, they might have to make a morale check. leadership. Under the base game, leaders are just there for combat and morale effects. They just give you a bonus on morale and on combat. You have the concept of line of communications, which I do not like the way it's too simple. This is all they give on it. And basically it's that all your retreats go towards that. This is one of those places where I feel like the game needs to be tweaked. In my case, the concept of localized retreats, which other games manage to do without a lot of additional words. I feel like something important is being missed there, which is that, hey, if I'm cut off from my line of communication, I'm going to take sort of a best route away from the enemy first. Then I worry about getting back to my line. I'm not going to retreat right in front of the enemy and get shot up. Okay. So the optional rules, skirmishers are one of the optional rules. I know that I had some difficulties with the way they were worded, but they're pretty simple. Like I said, kind of this abstracted cloud that you put out in front of you. They cancel each other out. They provide an extra firing opportunity as someone comes forward. The base game allows you to put light units in a skirmish mode where they have a higher firing range, which doesn't seem realistic at all. The clouds are much better, but on the other hand, those light units which are able to break down and skirmish at a longer range don't really have a significant advantage usually in the under the optional roles. Something like Nate versus Wellington, or I assume Wellington's Victory, allows you to just break those down into a bunch of skirmishers if you needed extra skirmishers. But those are games where you're only allowed to break off a certain number of skirmishers per unit. Here, the skirmishers, yeah, you're only allowed to have a certain number per unit, but they don't really affect the units. And the idea of giving up an entire light unit to turn it into something that isn't terribly useful seems a little strange. What might be a reasonable answer is some kind of formation, you could withdraw the light unit and create a cloud of skirmishers that are capable of operating on their own instead of being forced to stay close to a unit. That I would like. There aren't the counters to support it. If you had to do that, you'd have to make up a different kind of counter for those special skirmishers, and you'd probably want them aligned to a specific unit. That would be an interesting option. Skirmishers that could operate without being close to a unit. And that would fit the light unit usage a little better than what the game represents. They have some special rules on artillery losses. Strangely, they make artillery counter battery fire less effective than long-range fire against infantry, which I find very, very disturbing. But also some artillery retreat rules. When you have unlimbered guns, the crew runs away instead of taking the gun with them or whatever. Makes sense. A little bit of extra complexity, but definitely fits into the flavor. They differentiate between the different types of cavalry, giving them each their own bonuses. Oh, they also restrict the cav charge is actually restricted by the optional rules. I guess normally you can charge every round, every turn. There are little charge last turn or whatever markers to support that. They have an optional rule on routing. Normally, if a unit's disordered and it takes another disorder morale effect, it's just destroyed from the game, and the opponent gets score for it or whatever. This allows you to kind of clutter up the back ends. Again, a little bit more mechanically complex, but I like it being in there. Now, what may be the most... there's the optional rule on fatigue, which is sort of left as, hey, we're just really not sure of this. I like I like statements like that being put in by the designer. In fact, I feel like that almost belongs in most of these. As some kind of disclaimer of, yeah, this may have issues, just because they haven't spelled everything out. So you're not always sure what the designer's intent is with some of these options. The fatigue one, in particular, has some issues in terms of the definition of what is a core in each scenario is sometimes not clear to me. And this will fit in with the command rules as well, which also have this problem. But essentially what happens is each time you move or fight with a unit of the core, the entire core takes a fatigue hit. And once it gets enough of those hits, it starts taking a morale penalty. And you can regain those hits or recover them by just resting. And resting might include fighting. It just doesn't include moving and melee. Those are the two things that'll generate. It's got some problems, which is that, if one unit attacks or moves, the entire core is penalized for this. On the other hand, to be fair, the core is getting off kind of light if there's fighting going on by not being penalized for that at all. I really like the overall effect of it, because in most of these tactical games, units just keep fighting and fighting. Essentially until their morale's gone, until they're no longer an effective fighting force. And the fact that this reduces the morale, the thing that makes them an effective fighting force, it really puts you in a position where you kind of feel like you have to rest your units. You're not in a position where you can press an attack with fatigued units against other fatigued units, because even though you have a bonus, both sides have a penalty. As the attacker, you're in the position where you probably have to make your morale checks first. So your attack's probably going to fail in the same way that it would with two wrecked units sitting across from each other. But this allows you to recover in a way that the wreck, the idea of wrecked formations doesn't really allow you to recover. So if you're taking a lot of losses, a lot of your units may have reached their reduced morale level. That's going to be harder to recover. Now, one of the options is to allow you to recover some of your stragglers. But it's a hard process. You need a leader present. The unit has to be in good order. It can't move. It can't be fired at. And it has to succeed in a morale check. So basically, you don't see a lot of strength point recovery, at least in these one-day battles that I've been looking at. You might see it in something like, in some larger campaign like an Austerlitz game. I know he's done one of them. I don't have that one. That was done by AWE, and it kind of got tucked in after I thought AWE had disintegrated as a company. It's like from 2005 or something. Okay. Command and control. So this is the weirdest thing. The game throws a lot of options at you. And like I said, some of them are a little unfinished feeling. But this is one where it gives you 5 different levels of command rules you can add to the game. And the first one is essentially not much. It adds leader casualties to the game. Okay. The second one says your units have to be within range of proper command radius of their commander. And here it doesn't spell out something very important that applies in the scenarios. It says core, army, or wing. Okay, well, is that just your specific commander, or can you trace up the line of command? And I figured it was specific commander, but some of the scenarios start to make it seem like maybe the general idea is that it's the up the line of command too, so that the army leader can command units that are just flying around. That's what it certainly seems like when I look at this last battle that I did, Swarin or whatever, Sarin. I don't remember the names well enough. Then we come to the kinds of orders that that convinced me I want to play. I want this game. I want this series, which is, I'm going to need more video. Hold on. So, the third level of these orders, the first and second were the leader losses and command radius, which I feel like, you know, that's TSS era, right? All right. The third level comes closer to a musket and pipe type of order system, where you send an individual order to attack, withdraw, move, whatever, to units, to a core command. And actually, this is one of my gripes, is that the command rules are all based on the core level. And for a regimental game, I feel like I'm missing a layer there. Well, maybe 2 layers, right? So in the brigade series, in the Napoleonic Brigade series, you have corps and divisional leaders, and they can both have orders. In regimental games, I feel like there's that brigade level that should be in place too. There aren't enough pieces, I think, to justify going below divisional level in this. So I'm comfortable. I would be comfortable with 1 more layer of command, but without, and it really does feel like I'm looking at an NBS battle in terms of the quantity of pieces in each core command, which may indicate something. Maybe it's not a regimental level. I thought it was, though. Or maybe these battles are not regimental and the rest are. I don't know. Maybe I'm just mistaken there. Okay. So, what's nice about this third level is if you're playing against an opponent that you don't, explicitly trust, you can still play against them because the order is in front of them. You can see what they've gotten. You roll to see if they accept the order. You can make initiative rolls, etc. And there are penalties for failure of these. Orders always have a delay between when they reach, because they actually have to move across the board, and when they're actually implemented. They always have at least a 1-turn delay, even if they're immediately, I guess. See, this isn't spelled out. If there's no die roll, I'm not sure there's a delay. Again, not nailing everything down. Anyhow, those kind of chit orders work very well in a very competitive type of situation. The fourth level is more like the CWB, NBS style games, which is you write out orders and they're fairly specific and your unit just has to follow them. Now, this system gives you a great deal of flexibility on calling off orders. So after you've worked on an assault for 2 turns, you're allowed, complied with the requirements of an assault for 2 turns, you're allowed to call it off. Which, without any die roll or anything. And then you're just, sitting there in kind of the default defensive orders without any particular penalty against you. That means you're not going to have these really horrible actions that you sometimes see people get themselves into. And I kind of like those developing, where you're desperately trying to roll initiative to get out of the battle. But honestly, they probably are less historically accurate in Napoleonic era than in the American Civil War, and far less in any era than they show up in those games where I put a bad order into play or things just don't work quite right. And the commander doesn't show any, real initiative and just attacks stupidly. There are a fair number of conditions, though, even in the Napoleonic era, where commanders did some really boneheaded moves. So that is the system that I most was interested in. Then there was a fifth layer above that. And when I first read the AWE rules, maybe I didn't think too hard about that, but I thought, wow, how much further can you go? Well, that how much further is you don't roll for initiative, you don't roll for obeying orders and everything. This is really the group play role. And if you've ever played, I've played Terrible Swift Sword this way, and I've played some minis games this way, where each player is not allowed to communicate except by passing orders. If they get together in the same space, they can talk to each other, but otherwise they have to write orders and then interpret them themselves. That's a very, very nice way to play games, because if you have enough players to represent all the leaders on the board, you end up with people really kind of making decisions that are more fitting to the interpretation mistakes that would happen on a battlefield. And then you also have personalities coming into play. The problem with it, of course, is the players' personalities may not match the leaders that they're placed with, or they may try to pretend to be that kind of person, and they may not be capable of role-playing it accurately. So, for example, it's hard to role-play somebody. You can role-play somebody who's idiotic in terms of make some really dumb decisions, but it's hard to roleplay somebody who's a genius, and make decisions that are better than you would normally make. And that's kind of the problem with that side of things. Not that it really makes much difference. There's one I didn't play with, which is strategic deployment. Most of the scenarios didn't support this. I think Victoria did, and it basically allows you to preset the battle, and you really need additional rules beyond what's just given here. You need scenario-specific rules for that to work, I believe. I guess you could use these, but they seem very, very questionable to use in some situations. For example, if both sides were deployed for a couple days beforehand, which happened often enough. An option on putting time limits on the players. And then, here, let's throw a wrench in everything. An option on a completely interactive game where people, not quite chit pull, but people are alternating which unit they move, kind of like an SPQR or something like that. And when you throw all those options at somebody and the variety of them, you feel like the designer has tried to put together something saying, some people like this kind of game, some people like this kind of game. I'd put chip pull in it, but that would make me have to, design new counters, so I don't want to do that. I'm surprised there's not a rule. If you want to make your own counter chits for it, do a chip pull. So in a lot of ways, what you have is a base game that's largely well-defined. And then this series of options that aren't really heavily spelled out. That you can kind of mod your game to fit your own taste. And again, that to me feels very much like a minis type set of rules. Minis rules tend to be fairly sparse with a lot of, and you can do this, and you can take account of this if you want to, but you don't have to, And it's the options, especially the command options, which drew me to this design. I found some of them worked very, very well, but some of them I was left with, well, how do I deal with this? Given the way the scenario is described, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at any level of these rules, of the command rules. It only seems to make sense if you can move all your pieces or whatever. And some of that, I think, has to do with not considering the scenarios heavily enough. I feel like, but some of it may have to do with the designer having an intention in the rules that isn't coming through to me, and then in the scenario, I'm seeing hints of what the designer's actual intent was with the rules, and I'm just like, well, where do you get that from? So that's part of what kind of shakes me up about it. Overall, I don't know. You know, I was a lot happier with my NBS rules because, especially by version 3, they seem to get the history right, and I'm not sure this doesn't. I haven't seen too many things that really disturb me in that sense, but they really kind of nail everything down. On the other hand, the lightness of these rules makes them much easier to digest initially, but sometimes harder to figure out what the hell was meant. And there's something kind of refreshing about looking at that. Hey, here's a game kit, you know. Fit together the pieces you like, discard the ones you don't. You want the interactive play, go for that. You want, you know, written orders, that's cool. You want chit orders, that works, whatever, you know. But in terms of the amount of support that these rules, these optional rules are given, not all of them. Some of them, like the skirmishers, the cav, those are fairly well carved out. But the orders rules in particular are not terribly well carved out. The fatigue rule is not terribly well carved out. But for the same reason that one of the problems with the orders rules is, which is that the commands aren't well defined in the game. I'm not sure who commands what in some cases, which affects fatigue. So when you're facing something like that, then where the rules aren't, you know, the core idea of the rules is there, but they're not really nailed down terribly well. I'm in the position that I was in when I thought about, gee, why do I need to get the LOB Gettysburg when I have Terrible Swift Sword and I could just throw an orders system in there and just, you know, write my own orders. What's nice about this is it shows that, hey, you don't need that heavy layer of orders writing support that the CWB NBS rules have. This gets by with a lot less and still works. So it kind of gives me the, gee, maybe I should get Labatt, which is probably, you know, better nailed down in terms of this is the designer's idea of what he wants to represent combat with. Rather than this, well, here's the combat at a kind of light level and let's add a lot of stuff onto it as options. And just use some of the ideas from this in terms of the add-on type stuff. In particular, the command roles. But maybe fatigue as well, because I really like the effect the fatigue had. And I'm beginning to think that something like that probably belongs in every game at the level that it's presented here. I think he really gets it right on that. I was very impressed with what I saw it do on the field. As opposed, so, I mean, there are other ways you could keep track of fatigue on an individual unit basis. Terrible Swift Sword does that as an option, and it's horrible. You know, but this on the sort of on the command level, whatever that command level is, divisional, core. In this case, it's core. I think worked pretty well, and did something good for me. But the fact that he's able to get away with, you know, loose sketches of rules that I could have made, right? I'm not going to nail everything down, but I might well mod a game in this sense, and I've done it with other designs, and I've thought about it. You know, like I said, with Terrible Swift Sword, I thought about doing that instead of getting the regimental stuff for Gettysburg. But kind of had the, I don't know, it wasn't designed for it. But, you know, it doesn't have to be. Most games that allow you free movement and action get you way too much bloodshed. And even the CWB stuff, and even this without fatigue, your units are fighting too much. So the combination of the orders writing, and the orders writing here is lighter, so you end up engaging more often, and the fatigue rules actually do a pretty good job of keeping the battles from being too intense. So, yeah. And the other side of it is there are more battles in this than there are in NBS. Now, Labatt has a lot more battles. So we're gonna see if I'm gonna have to splurge into that side of things too. But as of right now, I have a fair number of these, and I'm not absolutely committed to getting the rest of, whatever shows up or whatever. But I have enough that I can enjoy this system. It's a lighter system at the basic game, which is to say, it's probably just a little above the Triumph and Glory stuff, which felt way too abstracted for, what I really wanted. But there's these different gradations of how much detail you want in the game. And this sits in a space that I'm not sure that anything else really does. You've got the... I don't know who did it. 3W is putting them out. I seem to want to say Miranda, but I don't know if it was. Probably not. They were fairly simple games that are sort of on that Napoleon at Waterloo and Napoleon's Art of War style of game, which feels almost operational in texture. And then you've got kind of the Triumph and Glory series. The OSG stuff is doing battles too now, which are all sort of on an expanded Napoleon at Waterloo. The Triumph and Glory, or Jour de Gloire, ends up being a little bit higher than that. You've got actual fire combat instead of just that sort of strength versus strength roll. Odds combat. You've got the differentiation between fire and melee. You've got some formation, this, that, and the other, but it all feels very light, especially with the chit pull going on. Formations are very flexible. Then you've got this coming after that, where the formations start taking an important role in the game, and maybe more so than even in NBS, but the mechanics or mechanical aspects of, say, a cav charge, of melee, are somewhat more abstracted in this. And NBS, I feel like, is the next level up. And I would guess Labatt is the next one up from there, where you're really worried about the formations, just even more so here. One thing about those formations is by putting a focus on that, the game ended up more of a maneuver game than I'm used to with, my Civil War stuff. Certainly you wouldn't expect that to be as good on maneuver as a Napoleonic, but NBS doesn't really capture the maneuver as well as the system does. And I think that's kind of, a matter of that Minis focus. Is Minis games tended to be more about maneuvering your units than the mechanisms of combat and getting the force in the right place in the same way. Here you're worried more about trying to get an outflank or something like that for the firing advantage, which is much harder to do because the units move too much, are too flexible in terms of how they can reposition in some of the other systems. Anyway, that's my thoughts overall. And not, gushing over it at all, but it is filling a space that, at least for now, that I need filled. After I look at Labatt and maybe the OSG stuff, but I don't think that's going to fill the space at all. After I look at Labatt and think about modifying that, this may fall behind. But the real problem for me is a matter of coverage. NBS covered 4 or 5 battles. This covers a few more. I'd like to have one system that covers a huge range of battles, and that's leaving me with really only one option as far as I see it. So someday I'll have to crack it open and take a look. All right, up it goes.